I never set out to collect photographs, but it sometimes feels as if photographs set out to collect me, or that some strange genetic sequencing, plus the vagaries of fate, not only programmed me to be a collector of photographs, but even steered me towards the kind of photography I collect. I guess if I start at the beginning, there's this. I grew up with this photo. It's big, it's framed, and it's possibly still the most amazing group photo and wedding photo I've ever experienced. To this day, its tones remain lush and rich. The fabrics, lace, cotton, tulle, fur, are almost tactile. Its aesthetic arrangement is both weird and wonderful. The picture has at once 23 subjects. It is, after all, the portrait of a family. The eye travels around the image, giving pretty much everyone their due. And yet it has one singular subject, the bride, to which the eye is shepherded by a masterful arrangement of light and dark tones. I don't know who the photographer was, nor do I know anyone in this image. Well, that's not quite true. This is the wedding picture of my paternal grandparents, and I have a very vague recollection of my grandmother. But she looked nothing like this confection of bridal exuberance in the eyes of a 6-year-old, which was when I knew her. Even now, this image exerts a fascination for a number of reasons. One is its implied narrative, which differs from the narrative I was told as a child, namely that my grandparents, immigrants who came to South Africa with nothing, fleeing the pogroms of Russia, were continually cycling between financial periods of just having enough to support their 6 children and periods of financial bust. But this image hardly looks like that of a financially struggling immigrant family. So one assumes they married in one of the boom cycles. But the image exerts a greater fascination because of the faces and the people depicted. There's the cruel martinet of a mother, the pedantic schoolteacher, the innocent who died tragically young, the playboy, the boy who later married out of the faith, the businessman, the spinster. Alternatively, there's the heartbroken widow, the husband having an affair, the future parliamentarian, the homosexual, the future rabbi, the suicide, the doting mother of 6. Or none of the above. Or all of the above. The possibilities are endless. As is my fascination with the image. But in no sense at all is this image of interest to me because its subjects are my relatives. If they were yours, I would feel equally passionate about it. Because good images are both pleasing to the senses and invite you into an experience that is simultaneously outside of you, depicting experiences, people, or landscapes you have never been in contact with, but that are also inside of you, that trigger and ignite imaginative wonder. I have always been a person of hungers, and perhaps because of the dominance in my psyche of this one image, those hungers have frequently expressed themselves in visual art, and specifically in photography. Certainly by the time I was an early teen, I was taking photographs, first with a Pentax Spotmatic, then with a Canon AE1, to iconic amateur SLRs. At some stage, in late high school, I went to art school and did a diploma in photography. Around the age of 16, I discovered D.N. Arbus, and most importantly, the South African photographer David Goldblatt, some of whose work I understood, and some of which it would take me a time to understand. I bought the odd photo in a junk or antique store. My deepening immersion in theatre led me to amass images, postcards or photographs or artwork that I liked or found amusing, or which challenged or provoked me. I would cover entire walls with them in huge collages. These images fed my creative imagination and informed my work in the theatre. I didn't know it then, but this gathering together of postcards was an initial stage of collecting, the accumulation of objects. But I didn't consider myself a collector. On the contrary, my brother was the real collector in the family. A philatelist, he collected German Southwest African postmarks between 1914 and 1915. I mean, for crying out loud, he didn't even collect stamps. Now, that was collecting. Cerebral, specialized, arcane. I just liked pretty pictures. And then, sometime after coming to the US and finishing graduate school, I discovered 2 things: eBay and daguerreotypes. They were a fatal combination. eBay catered to my worst personality traits, competitiveness and acquisitiveness, and daguerreotypes were the gateway drug to the beauty of 19th century photography. And to be sure, it was the beauty of a daguerreotype that seduced me. Not only of the exquisite young man depicted, though that was certainly a motivating factor, says he, revealing his sexuality, but also the beauty of the object itself, its mirrored surface which reflected your own image as well as the photographic likeness that floated delicately on its polished surface, the embossed papier-mâché case with its plush velvet pad, and the way you held the object, image and case, cupped in your hand at just the right angle to catch the light. This was my first major eBay purchase. I think I paid $500 for it then, which was a breathtaking and perilously profligate amount I could ill afford. And it is still not an insubstantial amount of money even today. But I don't regret it, because the more I looked, the more the marvel of early photography revealed itself to me. Look at the subtlety of Hill and Adamson's portrait of the Drysdale brothers. Their relaxed formality, not quite intimate, but tender, like brothers, suggesting connection but also individuation. Each holds their own ground and focus within the hierarchy of the composition. And look how the image subtly suggests that one might be a thinker and the other a dreamer. Look at the artistry with which an anonymous artist portrayed two gentlemen wrestlers, trying to accentuate the dynamism of their pastime by lowering their center of gravity, increasing the angularity of the pose, setting the bodies off against a cloth backdrop even though the image is taken outside on grass. One forgets frequently that there was a sheer determination and enormous physical courage needed by these journeyman artists, venturing into foreign, frequently hostile worlds, lugging huge equipment and working within the formidable limitations of the form and technology of the time to bring back to the burgeoning European middle class the exotic, the historic or ancient, the view of the other. But even these seemingly genre images reveal surprises and the often overlooked creativity of their makers. There is the fact that Francis Frith's crocodile is, reportedly, a stuffed prop. But notice how the landscape and the animal's skin are so evocative one of the other. There is what might be viewed as a pedestrian image of a Middle Eastern ruin. But looking closely, we see that the photographer, Louis Vigne, included for scale or in affection his native guide. And there's more. The photographer included himself in the form of an amphora, with a European walking stick balanced precariously atop it, and two metal mugs and a flask. In the arrangement and inclusion of these items, a world of narrative opens up. Of course, this is deepened when we learn that this is an image of the El Achbel funerary tower in the Valley of the Tombs in Palmyra, Syria, and that it was blown up and destroyed by ISIS in 2015. In what could be a typical ethnographic portrait of an Arab woman by the well-known photographer Félix Bonfils, curator Daniel Strong points out that the image is actually most likely taken by Bonfils' wife, Lydie, who would have had greater access to and ease at photographing Muslim women. The notion that this image might well be a product of a female gaze does much to change our relationship to and the reading of the image. A similar refocusing takes place if we look at what could be a genre image by a white European photographer of an African in quasi-European dress. When we realize that this image is from a series intended to be made into calling cards or carte de visite, and thus was in all likelihood commissioned by the black man who is its subject, a reversal of the assumed power dynamic shifts. The notion of who has the greater power, artist or client, master or servant, changes. And indeed, the whole colonial endeavor is exposed in greater complexity than we might otherwise have thought. And then there's the depth and complexity of thought that those early practitioners exercised in their craft. Take a look at the seemingly ordinary portrait. A young couple, probably newlyweds, look how smart and formal their dress is, look how the odd position of the woman's left hand at her waist specifically highlights the tinted gold ring. But there's other information hidden in this image. The crease in the freshly unfolded backdrop likely tells us that these were folks who lived not in an urban center where photographers might be plentiful, but someplace more remote, Iowa perhaps, where the itinerant photographer had had to set up shop and had no time to iron the backdrop before these sitters arrived to have their picture taken. There's also something weird in their pose. What are their hands doing? I've mentioned the ring hand, but if we look at the other oddly posed hands, we see that they are each holding or shielding a daguerreotype case, in which we can assume an image resides, and one can surmise that that image is a portrait of the other. Why do I feel fairly secure in that assumption? Because the kicker here is the empty case on the table. That's the case we are now cradle in our own hands as we look at the image. It's the case that both holds the picture of the newlyweds we're looking at and the case that is in the picture we're looking at. I like to call this, if you'll excuse my French, a mindfuck alert. This was a wealthy young couple who could afford 3 daguerreotypes to celebrate their big day. It is unlikely that they would have had 3 copies of themselves as a couple taken. Daguerreotypes were, after all, personal and private keepsakes. But it is likely that each would have sat for an individual portrait before sitting for one as a couple. Everything in the image points towards this narrative, and the intellectual acuity of the maker allows us some 170 years later to discover it. And did I mention playfulness? Our view of the Victorians is frequently that they were moralistic and dour, sombre and stolid. Not. But in this new medium, they found certainly a place for humour and play, be it in dress-up, as in Julia Margaret Cameron's literary and biblical-infused creations, or in dressing up, be it themselves, or the page that depicted themselves, or in the situation. That's a trick photo, using the potential of the medium for double exposure to show a man, forcing himself to write a letter he doesn't want to write? They also used the same technology to conjure up ghosts and spirits. They found, even in the long exposures and with limited portability of equipment, a frequent lightness of tone in the way they represented themselves, their friends and social circles, and their, who knows what's going on here? Whatever it is, moralistic, dour, sombre, and stolid, it is not. Neither were they shy of emotion. Here's happiness. And here's heartbreak. And here's a solemn little boy with big ears who has, for reasons unknown, posed with a wrench in his hand, something I always find disquietingly mournful and sad. Here's Roger Fenton's portrait of one Major Cathcart who served in the Crimean War. The stoic horse, certainly not presented poised for action, looks less resigned to his fate than the downward-looking, round-shouldered, almost defeated man who sits upon him. This is not a portrait of war as an heroic endeavour, but of the grinding, soul-destroying slog of battle. And it's different to another view of soldiers by Gustave Le Gray. Here ease, poise, and the leisure of camp life are all artfully and self-consciously captured. And this differs markedly from a gorgeous, almost casual image of male camaraderie and intimacy seen in the simple portrait of members of an army battalion. In short, when I opened the door to early and 19th century photography, I saw the extraordinary diversity of expression, the explosion of curiosity, the multiplicity of creativity that the medium unleashed upon the world. And as I had a hunger, I kind of just walked on through that door and devoured everything I saw. And that's the thing about collecting if you're born with that genetic disposition. It's not enough to just look and enjoy from afar. You want to possess the object of your desire. You can't be content with admiring the house from a distance. You want to own the bricks and build the damn thing yourself. But the thing is, at the beginning, you have no clue what you're building, and you barely know what a brick is, let alone a shingle or a piece of sheetrock or siding. And mortar, the stuff that holds the whole edifice together, forget about it. So the first stage of collecting is accumulation. You acquire, and you get good stuff and mediocre stuff and lots of crap. You start to see what's out in the world, and you chase the shiny bits madly and don't recognize that the not-so-shiny bits are actually much more interesting and valuable than those sparkly things that catch your eye. And over time, and with a lot of wasted energy and, it must be said, wasted money, you see and you learn, and you begin to enter the second stage of collecting, discrimination. It's here that you start to be able to sort out what's good and rare and interesting and special in your eyes from the stuff that's not. You understand the function and value of wooden shingle versus asphalt shingle, and what makes brick different from cinder block, or where and how each of those might be useful in their own way. You start to make qualitative judgments, and you have some of the knowledge you need to be able to do so. At the same time, you start to enter stage 3, formulation. In short, you begin to ask yourself, what is this thing I've built? Does it have a shape and form and meaning? You discover mortar and what holds the whole thing together and the whole edifice up. You realize that you really don't need that lovely parachute you fell truly, madly, deeply in love with at the yard sale to build a house, but that vintage stained glass window might look great at the top of the stairs. In my case, I realized 2 things. One, that I was unknowingly creating a collection about photography, about the history of the medium from its very earliest manifestation to the beginning of modernism. That's why this exhibition starts with the founding forms of the medium, daguerreotypes, and the calotypes of William Henry Fox Talbot, and ends with Alfred Stieglitz's seminal image, widely considered as perhaps the first modernist image, the steerage, which you'll see on that wall over there. And 2, that my interest was not necessarily in the established canon. I was equally, if not more, interested in the image taken by an anonymous photographer, as I was in the image by an acknowledged heavy hitter like Gustave Le Gray. I was interested in travel photos, and class photos, and souvenirs, and art photos, and documentary reportage, and industrial photos, and advertising photos, and photo objects, and photo albums, and group photos, and solo portraits, and erotica, and animal photos, and what we call occupationals, which is a genre depicting people by profession, and scientific, and medical, and architectural photos, and mug shots, and on and on. It has become common to speak of the photography market, by which we mean largely the art photography market. This is a market that consists of, to generalize, name brand photographers of the 19th century, canonical photographic artists of the early and largely mid-20th century, and modern and contemporary artistic work. Everything else, for years looked down upon, and Dale Kaplan, I am sure, will talk about this as she is one of the champions and heroes of these images and artifacts, came to be called, somewhat problematically, vernacular photography, the utilitarian photography that populates our everyday life. But in fact, it seems to me, vernacular photography is photography, or it constitutes the vast majority of it. The outlier is the so-called art photography that dominates the market and frequently the conversation. And it was photography, with a big, broad, expansive, eclectic P, that captured the full range of my imagination, and thus my heart. And nowhere is this more evident than in a part of the photographic universe which is barely touched upon in this show, but which is critical to me and which constitutes a whole other collection of mine, the world of the humble snapshot. In 1888, Kodak introduced the very first amateur camera. For $25, not cheap, you got the camera and 100 exposures. You pressed the button, sent the entire camera back to Kodak in Rochester, New York, and they did the rest. That is, they developed, printed, and mailed your pictures with their distinctive round format and your newly loaded up camera back to you. They made 5,000 of these cameras, and mine is close to the end of the run, number 4,900 and something. They followed this up a year later with an improved camera, and then quickly thereafter an even more improved version called the Kodak No. 2 that took images with a larger diameter. All these cameras you can look at in that vitrine over there, but what's cool is that my Kodak No. 2 was proudly owned by this guy, and this pic and two of his albums filled with photographs shot with this very same camera are on display in another nearby vitrine. Kodak was revolutionary, and to appreciate why, we need to come back to our invitation card and the Kodak No. 2 on it. One might think that this is the picture of a photographer with his camera, but is actually much more than this. It's the image of the passing of a torch, or a duel between the past and future. The revolution that Kodak launched was to transfer the making of pictures from the skilled and technically learned to the unskilled novice. Suddenly, anyone and everyone could take pictures pretty much anywhere. Kodak domesticated the camera and the act of photography, introducing them into the popular sphere of the middle-class family and its experience of the world. And we see that in this image. A man in a hat and buttoned-up suit, with his bulky, large-format camera mounted on a tripod to stabilize it, carefully timing the exposure with his pocket watch, as seen by an unseen photographer who only had to press the button on the camera he or she held in their hands for the image to be realized. We're seeing the old through the eyes of the modern. In truth, photography was the ideal medium for the 19th century and the birth of the modern age. Its technological nature, combining engineering, chemistry, and optics, its apparent realism and documentary utility, the comparative speed of image creation and ease in producing and disseminating multiples, its portability and eventual ubiquity, all these fit snugly into the century's rapid advancement in technology and science, industrialization and urbanization, into the growing mercantile middle class with its equally growing disposable income, into a world of expanding colonialism which would introduce us to our first taste of modern globalism, and even, indeed, to populism, fakery, and propaganda. Sound familiar? Anyone remember the promise of the early internet as a great democratic purveyor of knowledge and create connectivity, rather than the cesspool of fakery, hacking, bilious hate-mongering, and scapegoating, endless clickbait, and advertising that it's become? It's eerily similar. What we see in looking at these pictures is the exuberance of a medium both celebrating its age and its own delirious and possibly naive potential to both document and shape that age. What astounds me, and continues to delight me though, is the aesthetic modernity of the medium that seemed there from the very beginning. How modern and oddly contemporary these early images appear. It's almost as if the medium emerged fully formed into the world, carrying with it, even in its embryonic stage, the seeds and shadows of its own demise. It's difficult looking at this early daguerreotype by Gilbert de Prangy of shutters in Cairo and not feel that the framing, composition and viewpoint is particularly and peculiarly contemporary. Or to look at this image of glassware by Talbot and not see it foreshadowing the work of Andreas Gursky. Every time I look at this painted tintype, I cannot help but be struck how it inadvertently evokes Picasso's portrait of Gertrude Stein, or how Edouard Baldus's image of an artesian well evokes, a century later, the typological work of Bernd and Hilla Becker of the Dusseldorf school. It's even stranger to think how the reception of photography, the battles that raged over whether it was a utilitarian trade or could be considered a fine art, a battle that is largely over, but whose effects can still be felt in the remarkable affordability of photography compared to other areas of fine art collecting. How that battle between art and commerce, high and low, could be seen to be embodied in the opposing temperaments of its earliest inventors, the extroverted middle-class populist showman and artist Louis Daguerre, and the aristocratic and restrained gentleman scientist Henry Fox Talbot. Or how, in our present digital age, we've come full circle. Photography started out in the hands of experts and transitioned to the hands of the untrained amateur. It can be argued that in the digital age, we no longer strictly practice photography or the drawing with light. Instead, we make images, and the sensors and numbers that constitute this comparatively easy technical feat are far removed from true photography, an arcane and once again specialized practice that has reverted to being safeguarded only in the hands of the trained and the few. Collecting photography is, I like to say, an exercise in radical empathy, in being able to say, I will be there with you and see this on your terms and through your eyes. What the continuing journey of collecting photographs has taught me is that the journey from the 19th century there to the 21st century here is shorter, closer, more intimate, and much more thrilling than I would originally have thought, gazing up at this fascinating but slightly forbidding picture as a 6-year-old, almost half a century ago.